Welcome once again to High Desert Radio, the voice of the Jewish Federation of New Mexico. And now, here's Federation President and your host for this episode, Ron Hart.
This is High Desert Radio, the Jewish Federation of New Mexico, and I'm Ron Hart, welcoming today Dr. Alma Gottlieb, who will be speaking at the Jewish University in Santa Fe. And I'd like to talk a little bit with her about her background and her work. She's a cultural anthropologist, has published widely. She has outstanding awards that go from a Guggenheim Fellowship to National Endowment for the Humanities, Woodrow Wilson, Winter Grin, and various organizations. Welcome, Dr. Gottlieb.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
As a cultural anthropologist, you mentioned that you're impassioned by understanding all things that are human. And you're particularly interested in directing your research toward tolerance, reducing injustice, and understanding people and how people live. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Thanks. That's a really great place to start because it's really the big picture behind everything I do. I've studied many diverse topics and many diverse communities around the world. So it might seem that my career is perhaps fragmented or disconnected, but in fact, the unifying thread behind everything I do is trying to understand people in all of our complexities and reduce the sadly all too human tendency toward othering, by which I mean thinking about other people as so different from us that we begin to lose track of our shared humanity. So I've started out my career initially a very long time ago as an undergraduate, being fascinated by Native Americans as an American. Once I started delving into the early history of this continent before European conquest, that was probably the first group of other people who lived lives very differently from how I did and those I know around me did. And I branched out from there to looking at Africa, and I've really devoted the rest of my career especially to looking at Africans. As a white American, I think it's really critical to engage with understanding peoples who are often vilified, put in a savage slot, and seen as so irredeemably different from us that it's hard to remember that we're part of the same species and have the same evolutionary history. So my early research was in sub-Saharan Africa, living in circumstances very different from what I'd grown up with in small rural villages in the rainforest that lacked electricity and running water. The residents of these villages were what anthropologists sometimes call animists, worshiping many spirits and ancestors. More recently, I've engaged with a very different section of Africa in Cabo Verde, the islands off the west coast of Africa, 350 miles from Senegal in the Atlantic. And these folks certainly are living lives that appear more modern to folks like myself, and yet have many components of their history that are quite different from mine. So I'm sort of juggling otherness and difference and separation and humanity, and constantly looking for ways to find the right balance to dignify difference and yet not vilify it.
Yes, yes. You were president of the Society for Humanistic Anthropology, and could you comment a little bit more for people who are not familiar with the field of anthropology? What is that society within the larger professional field?
Yeah, that's a society that's really dear to my heart because it keeps reminding us as anthropologists that in addition to being social scientists, meaning valuing precision and scientific methods and some version of replicability and the kinds of inquiry into facts that all scientists of every stripe value, we also want to keep front and center the emphasis that the object of our study is not a thing, it's not a chemical, it's not a body part, it's the set of complete human beings with all of our messinesses, all of our complications. And in order to really respect those complexities and subtleties, people with a humanistic stripe often like to make use of a variety of writing strategies and other strategies beyond writing a simple, somewhat dry scientific sounding report, as if we were reporting on a body of cells or another species. When we write in that kind of dry scientific term, it sometimes has the unfortunate unintended consequence of reducing the human subjects to something that doesn't sound fully human. And so people who call themselves humanistic anthropologists like to experiment with different writing forms. I myself have made use of narrative. I'm married to a writer, Philip Graham, and from him I've learned and borrowed many narrative techniques. And in writing, for example, about people replicating conversations that we've had, I think that makes it easier for a reader to get into the heads of somebody else when we can, in a sense, eavesdrop on their lives via conversations. It also puts people who might seem to be prone to be slotted into that so-called savage slot onto an equal footing with us, because a conversation, by definition, is rooted in equality, in equality rather than inequality. So conversations, I think, are a particularly great genre to engage with a humanistic bent. Other humanistic anthropologists have written poetry, short stories, ethnographic fiction, rooted in their research, but packaged in a more friendly, user-friendly or reader-friendly form than the typical scientific report.
Yes. Actually, the first time I met you was at an anthropology meeting in the 1990s, and you and Philip, in fact, were doing a session together, talking about how you were interweaving your writing styles. And in the book Parallel Worlds, which won the Turner Prize for the best best ethnographic writing. Am I getting that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the book the two of you put out at that point won this very important prize, and it's fascinating writing to see how the two of you interact.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We wrote that book together early in my career. It was the first foray that I attempted, thankfully with, a master of writing, into a different kind of writing beyond what I'd been trained in graduate school, in a more cut and dried scientific prose. And I have to say, after working with Philip on that book, and the book was written for a general audience. It's a memoir of our fieldwork, the first two fieldwork engagements we had in these small villages in West Africa. And it's written in the first person, alternating first person sections by Philip and me. So we author our own sections in the singular first person. Right. And we have no footnotes and no bibliography. And Philip, as a writer, exercised veto power over any scientific jargon that I might have been tempted to insert. And I retrained myself into writing in a very different style. And ever since then, all of my writing, I think, has at least made some use of those kinds of narrative techniques of crafting a story, of including dialogue, drawing fully, I hope, drawn characters so that readers can get a sense not just of a group of people, the Bang do this, the Bang do that. That's the group of people I've been working with in Ivory Coast. But this Bang person named Amla, this Bang person named Kofi did this. Right. And by deconstructing groups like that and reminding readers that groups are ultimately made of individuals and that individuals have their own biographies and that they're not replicas or factory clones of one another. I think that's another really powerful way that as social scientists who are also writers, we can remind our readers of our shared humanity.
Right, right. So in your work in Africa, to me it was interesting, you've moved around up the coast of Africa to arrive to Cabo Verde. Mm-hmm. And could you talk a little bit more about the experience there? Now, I know that you've looked at the last 500 years of Jewish influence, more or less 500. The Portuguese conversos arriving, and you also mentioned the Moroccan Jewish influence that arrived there. Could you talk a little bit about that background and eventually how that arrives in the diaspora?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right that I did move around the coast from the Francophone section of Africa to the Lusophone Portuguese speaking section of Africa, from the rainforest into a more temperate zone. It took me quite a few years to make that switch. It was well thought out and deliberate, and in some ways difficult decision, having to do with the politics of Côte d'Ivoire. And it's a process that I chronicled actually in the first bit of writing that I published about the new work in Cabo Verde in a book that I titled The Restless Anthropologists, a collection of essays that I edited and included one by myself about anthropologists who switch field sites in mid-career and try out new communities. I chose Cabo Verde for many different reasons, one of which was that having been raised as an American Jew myself, I decided that it was time in mid-career to actually make use of my own identity and also explore nooks and crannies of my own heritage with which I was less familiar. I had been raised as a relatively secular, certainly Reform Jew, with grandparents who were practicing Orthodox Jews. And so as a child, I straddled two worlds, even within the Jewish community, let alone the Jewish and non-Jewish community. I think it is one of the things that drew me to anthropology because having commuted back and forth between Reform and practice in Jewish communities from a very early age, young childhood, I intuitively sense that there are many different ways to live a life, even among co-religionists in the same state. Cabo Verde has a particularly fascinating history, and I was originally drawn to it not because of the Jewish connection, but because of language. My husband and I started listening to a lot of Portuguese music, fell in love with the music and fell in love with the language, decided to start learning the language to understand the music. And as I started reading in Portuguese, decided to start reading the history of Cabo Verde, which was probably the one country in the entire continent of Africa about which I knew the least. As a trained Africanist, I taught the history of Africa for many, many years, and that was the one country about which I'd never said a thing. And once I decided to look into it, I became more and more fascinated by many things. And perhaps the one thing that most shocked me was reading this early Jewish history of the country, a fact of which I had been entirely unaware and of which all of my Africanist colleagues were entirely unaware. So that's, as a scholar, something that's really exciting to find. And of course, as a Jew, it also spoke to me in, really interesting ways. I don't have Sephardic ancestry myself, and so I also set about learning the history of the Sephardic diaspora. So there were a lot of challenges in taking on this new project, which has a very deep and robust and fairly well-documented history. The history is still being documented, but it's started. So it's taken me a while to start publishing. I have published several articles. I've given a lot of talks, and I'm now fully ready to finish the book that I started a long time ago. But I won't say that I've mastered the history, but certainly there's been a lot of history to delve into.
Yeah.
One of the things that fascinated me about the project methodologically as an ethnographer is the fact that it is a global diaspora, like other aspects of the Sephardic diaspora, which is global. The Cabo Verdean diaspora is also global. Whenever I meet a new Cape Verdean, one of the things they'll often tell me first is giving me a list of all their relatives around the world. And every Cabo Verdean I've met anywhere in the world, and I've met a lot in many different places, can always recite relatives on at least 2 other continents, and some on 3 or even 4.
Yeah.
And much of that has to do with the nature of the early Portuguese Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries, which was the first global empire.
Right.
And so Cabo Verdeans are a very cosmopolitan people, unlike the people in the rainforest with whom I've been working. And that was a real difference for me. And the option to find Cabo Verdeans many, many places around the world. Anywhere there's water, there'll be a Cabo Verdean. Being from an island nation, they tend to feel comfortable around water. Makes the project really fun for me as well.
And the thing of memory and culture, the early Portuguese who arrived there were many conversos, of course, and we do have that connection with New Mexico. But the difference between New Mexico and Cabo Verde is New Mexico is a remote. Conversos arrived here in the northern mountains of New Mexico because it was a remote region. They were distant from the Inquisition offices, relatively safe. The Cabo Verdeans were an island which also can be a refuge place. But as you mentioned, they're much more cosmopolitan. There's this diaspora of going out into various parts of the world. How is the memory maintained of a Jewish past, or which piece of identity? What's happening there?
Yeah, I love those questions. I should probably back up and just for listeners who are maybe less familiar, explain. The Cabo Verde Islands were unoccupied when they were first rediscovered by Portuguese mariners in the mid-15th century. And this was the period of global expansion by Portuguese and other mariners. Many Portuguese started coming to occupy the islands, and the more historical research being done in the archives by my historian colleagues, the more we're finding that a disproportionate number of those early Portuguese settlers on the islands were Jews, either practicing Jews or conversos, people who had converted to Catholicism, either by choice or by force, because the efforts of the Portuguese crown, which was allied structurally with the Catholic Church or Christian Church at the time, was starting increasingly to compel Jews to convert. And with the 1496 order of expulsion in Portugal of all Jews, and then the revision that any Jews could remain as long as they converted to Catholicism, a large number of Portuguese Jews and also Spanish Jews who had entered Portugal after they were expelled from Spain started leaving the continent in large numbers. They went mostly to better known places. Amsterdam was the number one destination in Europe, Istanbul the number one destination in the Mideast. Once Columbus crossed the ocean and started making inroads into conquering native peoples in the Americas. Many Jews also started coming to the Americas, including ultimately New Mexico, as you're mentioning. And then a tiny proportion of them wound up going to Cabo Verde. So in those early years when Cabo Verde was originally empty, most of the Jews who arrived were men. There were some women, but a larger number of men. They, both Jewish and Catholic Portuguese, started importing Africans, mostly as slaves, but not entirely, into the Cabo Verde Islands. And many of these men, both Jewish and Catholic, started cohabiting with and sometimes marrying legally African women who were sometimes their slaves and sometimes not. So there are a lot of complicated politics of race in those early years. Although they had fled the Inquisition, as all Jews did at the time, the Inquisition followed them to Cabo Verde, as it did to the New World. The Inquisition was very active in Mexico. That's what compelled Jews in Mexico to flee north. But the Inquisition really cast a long shadow, even in the hills of New Mexico, which is, I think, what accounts for the fact that these folks became what we now call crypto-Jews, hiding their own religion. And something very similar essentially happened with the Jews of Cabo Verde. The Inquisition didn't open an active court system to try people in Cabo Verde, but they sent spies from Lisbon to Cabo Verde. And the spies reported on many people who they claimed were openly practicing Jewish practice. It's hard to know how accurate that was. It probably was accurate for some and not for others. But some of these folks actually were shipped back to Lisbon and tried by the Inquisition. And those who weren't were terrified. But so there was a pall cast on these islands, which originally were billed as an island of refuge and soon became an island of fear instead, or a set of islands. There are 10 islands. And so Jewish practice, as it did in New Mexico, really went underground. So despite what I'm calling the cosmopolitan outlook, there was also, that was, I would say, counterbalanced by an insular sense of terror. The Inquisition really created what some scholars call a 300 to 400 reign of terror that had a global reach. Yeah. And it's really only recently, as with the descendants of crypto-Jews in New Mexico, that Cabo Verdeans have begun either discovering or acknowledging what they might have known but had refused to publicly acknowledge their Jewish ancestry. So these are very parallel processes in very different spaces.
Right, right. So how are the people today dealing with this identity, with this rediscovered or re-acknowledged identity of their Jewish heritage? What are they doing with it?
Yeah, well, that's the bulk of my book. So that's why it's so fascinating to me as an anthropologist. And one of the reasons I was really drawn to the project is this is such an exciting moment. This moment of cultural rediscovery and recuperation of suppressed memories is really exciting for a lot of these Cabo Verdeans. And they are incorporating the knowledge in very different ways, a spectrum ranging from, curiosity all the way to conversion to orthodoxy and everything in between. It's not one practice or habit or pattern. It's many, and that's what's so interesting because they're in touch with each other. So those who are not practicing, when they meet others who are interested. In some cases, that it inspires them to practice. In other cases, it doesn't. But there's some really interesting conversations across that divide from, not at all practicing to practicing quite actively, and seeing the conversations and refashioning of self, I think, is particularly interesting. The one ingredient that makes their experiences quite different from those of the crypto Jews in New Mexico is race. Many of these Cabo Verdeans consider themselves as Black or African, or those who are in the U.S., African American, and to incorporate a Jewish component into an identity of color in this racialized climate is especially intriguing, and it's one of the things that most excites me as a humanist dedicated to countering others, thinking about incorporating those quite distinct identities, Black and Jewish, into one subjective self is really intriguing. They're not the first Black Jews. There are quite a few other groups of Black Jews. There's now an association for the scholarly study of the relations between Blacks and Jews. Is a very new organization formed maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. And they've now had several international conferences. So there's an increasing, I think, excitement on the part of scholars to recognize this moment of African Jewish conversations that are taking place on several registers.
Yeah. Yeah, the title of your talk, which is Across the Seder Table, Africa Across the Seder Table, is very interesting, and it captures that sense. One of the other things that comes into this, the process of re-Judaization. You mentioned that, of course, there's the entire gamut of reactions to this identity and this heritage. What about re-Judaization? Those who want to become Jewish and establish that link. You mentioned that there were some who become observant, who become Orthodox.
Yep.
Could
and the title of my talk is both a metaphor and a literal comment, because in Boston there is now an annual Passover Seder that unites roughly 100 Cabo Verdeans and 100 American Jews, literally at 20 Seder tables, each of which has 5 Jews and 5 Cabo Verdeans. So it's by design meant to literally promote conversations across the Seder table, or in this case, across 20 Seder tables. And at these events, I've now attended quite a few, and I'm on the organizing committee for the event. A lot of Cabo Verdeans are meeting Jews for the first time. As far as they know, they may well have met other Jews without having any knowledge, but they're first having conversations with people who are obviously Jewish, and it often has a really interesting effect on them. Nobody initially leaves those seders saying, "I'm converting tomorrow," but it starts a process of introspection, and some of them discover for the first time that it's possible that they had Jewish ancestry that they didn't know about. Some of them discover that absolutely they must have had Jewish ancestry that they didn't know about. Some of them have confirmed a suspicion that they might have had Jewish ancestry, but they weren't sure. But there are various ways to confirm that. And if and when that's confirmed, once you find out that your ancestry is quite different from anything you knew, or is perhaps something closer to what you thought it might be, but you weren't sure, that reconfigures yourself, right? And once you start reconfiguring yourself, that's a really deep existential process that has unexpected consequences, some of which is sometimes actually converting, So some men are getting themselves circumcised, for example, so that they can join a conservative congregation. Some of them are becoming active members of congregations. That's a minority. Most of them are not. For those who don't become that level of involved, they're often doing things that are more private and personal, but nevertheless meaningful. They may start observing Passover, because that's often their entree through this community event. They may start reading a lot about the history of Judaism. They may start reevaluating their understanding of the politics of the Mideast crisis in Israel. They may start reading about the Holocaust and World War II and the history of oppression, and start seeing their own history of oppression, which they may have only thought about in racialized terms, suddenly in religious terms as well. So there are a lot of different paths towards rethinking what their own understanding of their place in the world might mean.
Yes, yes. Dr. Gottlieb, thank you so much for leading us into this incredible world of your work and Judaism in Africa, which is a new thing for many people, I think. Mm-hmm. And you will be giving the lecture on this at the Jewish University talk series in Santa Fe this week. And we look forward to hearing the more complete story.
Thank you. And I love the questions, and I'm looking forward to more at that event. Thanks so much for the thoughtful conversation.
On behalf of High Desert Radio, we thank you and look forward to further conversations.
That's it for this edition of High Desert Radio. Thanks so much for listening. High Desert Radio is the voice of the Jewish Federation of New Mexico. Remember, in order for us to continue providing quality programs like High Desert Radio and to continue our work in service to Jewish seniors, Holocaust survivors, low-income families, children, young professionals, Israel, and more, the Jewish Federation of New Mexico relies entirely on the generosity of listeners like you. Make your contribution today to jewishnewmexico.org. Remember, you can subscribe to this series on iTunes, and be sure to visit us at jewishnewmexico.org. Till next time, for High Desert Radio, I'm David Wolf.